Welcome to the first narrated episode on my second channel, where I'm making a world-building project about the future of humanity. This video will be a summary of all the important events that happened on Earth and in space in this timeline from the year 2025 to 2050. I also have 4 non-narrated videos about this section on the channel, going more in depth about Earth, the Moon, Mars, and asteroids respectively. Before I start, I should make a disclaimer. While this timeline is supposed to be at least somewhat realistic, it is primarily for entertainment value. The events that happen in this timeline do not reflect my political beliefs, nor do I want this timeline to happen in real life. This series is an alternate future of humanity, and I'm simply trying to make an entertaining scenario that could plausibly happen, not predict the future. If you disagree with anything in this timeline, just be aware that none of this is real, and I'm not trying to make a 100% accurate scenario that will happen in real life. Make sure to also check out my main channel's videos about space colonization, as they help explain why I made some of the events in space for this timeline. With that out of the way, let's start with the events that happened on Earth before moving to space. In 2025, declining Western support to Ukraine eventually forces Ukraine to surrender. Russia, exhausted from the war as well, claims the land it currently occupies, but not much else. Russia's plans for further expansion are halted as they're running out of military equipment and likely can't afford another war. The late 2020s are then defined by further chaos in the Middle East, as tensions between Iran, Israel, and Palestine continue escalating, eventually into a full-blown Israeli-Iranian war in 2027. More Middle Eastern countries eventually join the war, and after Iran begins attacking American military equipment in Israel, the US fully commits to the war. From 2029 to 2031, the United States and Saudi Arabia commit to a costly invasion of Iran that goes horribly, though progress is slowly made. As Iran is being invaded, rebel groups in the north begin rising up, splitting the Iranian military. By late 2031, the Iranian government has collapsed and the war fizzles out. A Kurdish state is released, Azerbaijan annexes some Azeri-majority regions in northern Iran, and a democratic regime is set up in the country. However, the US invasion of Iran and support of Israel is extremely divisive in both the US and across the world, and the political situation in the US gets worse. The country begins turning towards full isolationism and starts to slowly pull out of international affairs. However, the US leaves the Middle East in a complete mess as Iran, Jordan, Israel, and Palestine and Lebanon are all in ruins from the war. This leaves a power vacuum open for Turkey, which begins to strengthen its control over the Middle East. By 2032, the East African Federation is finally formed, and it quickly starts becoming one of Africa's most prosperous countries. However, it's surrounded by neighbors that either support or oppose it, and instability outside the EAF in Africa is on the rise, made worse by climate change. Between 2034 and 2038, Turkey begins a series of invasions across the Middle East, annexing land from Syria, invading and taking over the newly formed Kurdistan, and beginning a long and costly campaign in northern Iraq. This is all happening as climate change is ravaging places across the globe, leaving places like the Middle East, Pakistan, and parts of Africa even more unstable than they already are. By 2039, Somaliland begins being recognized by other African countries as independent, leading to the total collapse of Somalia as a country. By the early 2040s, the EAF in Ethiopia begins sending troops and resources into Somalia to restore order to the country, and Turkey ends its war in Iraq, annexing more land. As all this is going on, political changes are happening in both the US and China. China's population crisis is beginning to get bad, and they begin trying to interfere in Taiwanese elections to get pro-unification politicians in positions of power. An invasion of Taiwan is looking unlikely, as China begins trying more covert means to take over the island. Meanwhile, the US political crisis has no end in sight, and protests and riots are getting more and more common. Many are worried that a full-scale civil war is about to begin, and everyone agrees that something drastic must be done. By 2047, the war in Somalia ends, with Ethiopia and the EAF deciding to just take over Somalia for themselves. Somaliland and Puntland are released as independent countries, but the rest of Somalia is taken over, giving Ethiopia a coastline. The late 2040s sees further Russian expansion as Belarus joins Russia, and the United States has essentially become a police state as civil unrest gets worse and worse. Then, in 2048, things begin turning around, as in an extremely unlikely event, a good president with sensible policies is elected. This president begins making sweeping reforms across the country, actually managing to slowly fix problems. The United States has a long way before it fully recovers, but things are looking up, and a new golden age in the country is set to begin. As 2050 arrives, the world is a much more chaotic place, but there is hope that things will turn around. But that's just on Earth. Despite the chaos across the world, money is still spent on space colonization, and significant progress is made. In the late 2020s, several new commercial space stations are created, and there are more people in space than ever before. India launches its first crew to space, and the space industry begins improving all around. However, the moon is where things truly begin picking up. Despite the constant wars, the US still finds money to invest in sending humans back to the moon as the second space race begins. China does this as well, getting the first Chinese taikonauts on the moon in the early 2030s. The US begins building Gateway Station, the first lunar space station, and private companies begin successfully landing on the moon after the disasters of the early Eclipse missions. The US commits to further space development, mostly because of the growing space industry making it so companies can pay for it, not tax money. By 2032, the war in Iran is finally over, and the United States fully commits to the construction of the first permanent moon base. Using special variants of SpaceX's Starship rocket, the US begins construction of Artemis Base on the rim of Shackleton Crater on the lunar South Pole. China isn't far behind, along with Russia and several other countries, begins building the International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS. The first construction vehicles are sent to the moon, clearing out regolith and gathering materials to expand the two moon bases. Interest in the moon begins rapidly increasing as lunar tourism becomes possible for the super-rich. The Apollo 11 moon landing site in Mare Tranquillitatis becomes open for tourism in the late 2030s as Tranquility Base is established by the US. It can only hold a few people at a time, but as the world sets its sights on the moon again, things begin happening fast. Artemis Base begins expanding, and a second mining base nearby, Amaranth, is created. In 2039, a fence is set up around Tranquility Base, and the US declares that everything inside the fence is a part of Tranquility Base and therefore US territory. The United States becomes the first country in history to claim direct land on the moon, something that becomes possible after the revision of the Outer Space Treaty. The revisions of the OST take 7 years to complete, and it sets guidelines on how, when, and why a country or company can claim land on the moon. Countries claiming land in space is now possible, but heavily restricted. In the 2040s, India lands its first crew on the moon, and space stations capable of carrying 100 people to the moon at once are under construction. The US begins building the first lunar railroad between Artemis Base and Amaranth. India quickly begins establishing its own moon base, Chandra Base, in Faustini Crater, deciding to stay out of the escalating US-China fighting over Shackleton Crater. In 2043, after tensions over water mining rights in Shackleton reach a tipping point, China claims 120 square kilometers of land as ILRS territory. This land claim is a full 2,400 times bigger than what the US claimed for Tranquility Base, and American mining sites are now part of Chinese territory. The US quickly makes a counterclaim a few months later, establishing the borders for Artemis Base and Amaranth and creating a massive border dispute with China at the bottom of Shackleton Crater. The disputed land becomes named the Lau-Khao Triangle. In 2048, SpaceX is granted a small section of land on the outskirts of Artemis Base to create their own private moon base Alpha. It's supposed to be used to help send humans to Mars, though that hasn't happened yet. In 2049, as Russia's space program improves, the ILRS splits into two separate regions, the Chinese Autonomous Zone and the Russian Autonomous Zone. The two are still part of the ILRS together, but now have much more autonomy. China names their section Yegong, and Russia names theirs Korolevgorod. Meanwhile, as Tranquility Base begins allowing more tourists, the need for accommodations arises. The US begins plans to create the first lunar city in Tranquility Base, Aleva. And as 2050 arrives, both the US and China begin considering sending military equipment to the moon to take control of the Lau-Khao Triangle. However, because the moon's population is still less than 100 people, it's not worth it. Yet. However, the experience gained from working on the moon has led to a huge leap forward in orbital stations around Earth, and things like orbital factories and space hotels now exist. Mars has received a lot of attention, but crewed missions to it have been delayed over and over. China successfully becomes the first country to return samples from Mars in 2033 with their Tianwen-3 mission, a few years before NASA's Mars Sample Return mission. But the US manages to collect more samples than China, and MSR was the most complicated mission ever launched to Mars, and paved the way for future crewed missions. But with the years of delays and difficulties with MSR, the idea of crewed exploration of Mars gets kicked down the road. But progress is slowly made. With the construction of the Argo 2, a space station meant to travel between Earth and Mars inspired by the Argo, which I'll get to later, as well as the Starship Mars Landing System, or Starship MLS, humans land on Mars in the year 2050, about 80 years after the first moon landing. Starship MLS Endeavour makes it to Martian orbit on an uncrewed test in 2042, becoming the first Martian space station. MLS Viking makes the first landing on Mars in 2046, MLS Columbia delivers the first segments of the first Mars base in 2048, and finally the Starship MLS Eagle, named after the Apollo 11 lander, lands 5 crew members in Arcadia Planitia. The other 5 crew members on the mission remain in orbit on the Argo 2. A small but permanent Mars Research Station Alpha is created, but will likely take many more decades before it becomes a colony, if ever. While progress on sending humans to Mars is slow, humanity sees a lot more progress with asteroids. Several countries and companies send missions to asteroids throughout the decades, and there's a ton of interest in near-Earth missions. The crowning achievement of asteroid exploration happens in 2039, when an American crew takes a ship called the Argo to the near-Earth asteroid 2001 FR85. This marks the first time humans have ever visited an asteroid, and provided great practice for getting to Mars. China follows by sending humans to another asteroid, 2023 DW, in 2046. While the Argo is eventually reused for lunar development, China continues using their ship, the Haipeng, to send humans to 2002 CU-11 in 2049. All three of the crewed asteroid missions so far haven't been landings, but China is preparing to land humans on the asteroid 1036 Ganymede in the coming years, becoming the first country to land people on an asteroid. China has yet to land humans on Mars, but landing them on an asteroid will show not only that they're ready for it, but able to do something no one else has been able to do. While no permanent outposts on asteroids have been created yet, the first steps towards asteroid mining are made. However, most attention remains on the Moon, as colonizing Mars and asteroids are far off targets, and lunar colonization is not only possible but profitable. Humanity in 2050 faces a ton of challenges. Climate change is making life harder across the planet, and nations are collapsing. But a ton of progress is also made. The first moon colonies have been established, and humans have been to asteroids and even to Mars. Progress towards stopping and reversing climate change is being made, and space stations are making huge scientific progress that has gone to directly benefit people on Earth, and it will continue to do so as space colonization continues. There's a lot I didn't cover in the summary, so make sure to also watch the unnarrated versions of the future borders of Earth, the colonization of the Moon, the colonization of asteroids, and the colonization of Mars. Also stay tuned for the next installment of this series, which will cover the years 2050 to 2075. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, check out the rest of my colonization of the solar system and the Future of Earth series, as well as my main channel.